Welcome back to the history and evolution of the MMORPG genre, Part 2, The Measuring Stick. On November 23rd, 2004, World of Warcraft launched. It would be the opening of a world that would literally change the MMORPG genre. By 2009, it would be the most popular MMORPG with over 10 million regular players. If a person was a fan of video games, then they would have most likely heard of WoW, if not tried it at one point. How did it accomplish this? Why was WoW so much more popular than other games in the genre? And most importantly, how did it change the MMO genre? This is the second part of my exploration of the MMORPG genre's history, looking at what makes an MMORPG an MMORPG, and what each addition to this genre of video games takes from its predecessor, and what ideas it explores to make it unique. When Blizzard released WoW, they were actually taking a chance on one of their flagship properties, this being the Warcraft series, which was an RTS series of games. RTS meaning real-time strategy, which basically has the player acting as the general of their own armies as they try to collect resources and build up their forces to take out their enemies' armies. The most well-known game in this genre is StarCraft 2, which is also made by Blizzard. The Warcraft series seemingly was the perfect fit to turn into an MMORPG. It was a fantasy world, a common setting in the genre. It already had a long history and stories to build off of, and there was multiple different races in the games that could be turned into options for players. There was already a conflict between the factions of Warcraft, and the world had a lot of notable characters that could either be turned into allies or foes. The biggest hurdle was turning the game into a fully realized world from the top-down perspective of Warcraft. How did Blizzard do? Well, it's time to break out the MMORPG must-have list, or the KEDBQ system. I came up with the KEDBQ system to analyze MMOs by comparing them to others based on established traits that the genre has established. The 7 sections are character. How does the game allow players to customize their avatars and make them feel immersed? The economy. Is there a player-driven economy? Dungeons. What is the PvE content? PvE standing for player versus environment. Bosses. Are there unique enemies that provide extra challenges and experience? Competition. What is the PvP content? Endgame. What is there to do after hitting level cap? And the world. How is the world set up? First, we'll talk about character. At launch, there were 8 races to choose from, with half being on the side of the Alliance, and the rest loyal to the Horde. Now, each side has 2 more races, with a third that can choose either side. As far as classes, the different sides share 7 classes, with each side having their own unique class. Now, there have been 3 classes added, and this is far more concise and organized than EverQuest 2. Next, we'll look at economy. The player economy works through the profession system. Basically, players can choose a profession to create items or find materials that they can then sell at the auction house, where other players can then buy those for them to earn money. Now let's look at dungeons. PvE, or player versus environment, is where WoW hooks a lot of its players. For the most part, the players can complete quests all over the world that give them experience. Periodically, players will be able to join other players to complete dungeons. These typically involve 4 players in a small instanced area that must fight their way through large groups of enemies to complete objectives and ultimately beating a boss or multiple bosses depending on the dungeon. I should also point out that WoW does a good job of varying up what their quests are, rather than all the quests being the standard go for this person, or kill this thing, or collect a bunch of this. Occasionally, you'll have quests where you'll be looking for points of interest through an eyeglass, or riding on the back of a giant rhinoceros protecting a caravan. On to bosses. One of the biggest things that Blizzard improved on with their bosses was giving them more explicit mechanics. Basically, what this means is that bosses would have scripted patterns or gimmicks of attack that usually had specific ways of how to avoid damage. This may be avoiding certain areas, performing specific skills or abilities, or completing a mini objective during the fight. These encounters are some of the most memorable in the game. The screenshot that you've been looking at is actually from one of the first dungeons that I was able to unlock on this character. It had 4 bosses, and a couple of them had the gimmicks that I was talking about. One had totems that you had to take out before it could actually be damaged, and another was a giant Tyrannosaurus Rex that could make you walk over spots that would trigger more enemies to spawn. As for the competition section, WoW operated their PvP in multiple ways. Duels are an agreed-upon fight between 2 players. Arena PvP is between teams of 2, 3, or 5 players. Battlegrounds are where groups of Alliance and Horde compete in games of Capture the Flag. Players can also attack other players of the opposite faction if they both have their PvP flag on. This is an option once you reach a certain level and are in a certain area. This is a portion of the game that is extremely popular, mostly due to the rewards that come with being good at PvP. This includes special gear and titles. As for endgame, WoW's raid system is basically the entire endgame, and has kind of set the standard for endgames in MMORPGs. At the end of the story of WoW, and after the player has reached max level, they can keep improving their character by getting better gear. They can do this by crafting or by unlocking the raids. Every raid has multiple parts that must be tackled with a large number of players all working together to defeat the enemies in the raid and ultimately the bosses. They basically operate like giant dungeons, except instead of small groups of around 5 players, these can stretch upward to 40. Finally, we'll talk about the world of World of Warcraft. WoW is unique in that it's one of the few MMORPGs that is mostly persistent. This means that a player could start walking from one end of the continent of WoW and be able to walk to the other side without a load screen. It would take a while, but it is possible. The different continents are on their own areas, so players will have to load in between them, and all of the dungeons and raids are housed in their own smaller servers named instances, so that the events of the experience can operate smoothly. Predictably, the game passes the KEDBQ with flying colors. But how does it feel to play? Well, now I'll move on to talking about the user interface, or UI, and the play feel. I will be moving around the camera this time so I can hopefully get everything in screen on the video. Start off with the map again. Up here, you see a map, a mini map. It's smaller than the EverQuest 2 one was, but I believe that size is actually adjustable. Also, like EverQuest 2, you can pull up your map and you can actually make it to where it takes up the full size of the screen. And you can still move around on the map. You can see my little arrow there. This map is a lot more stylized, I believe, than the EverQuest 2 one was. The EverQuest 2 one was kind of more of a topographical feel. This actually feels like a map your player is pulling out, what with the design around the edges, this compass star here. But it does still have areas that it's telling you where you're going, like Orgrimmar up front and Dry Gulch Ravine. You even have certain NPCs on stage. It also shows you and shows what you're going towards that you're questing on these little bubbles. Speaking of questing, you can see it right here, kind of, is there is a diamond saying how many yards I have until I get to whatever quest I'm going towards. EverQuest 2 also had a system kind of like that, but you would click on where you wanted to go and there would be a kind of line leading you to where you needed to go. However, that didn't help when you were on horseback, because you would outrun the line and you'd have to wait for it to show back up. A lot like how EverQuest 2 was. Moving on to skills, is we have the quest bar down here, and again you can also click these to use your skills, by clicking on that to ride my mount. However, you could still use these by using your number keys, just like in EverQuest 2. That had become the standard by this point. Movement is also the standard. WASD keys to move your character around. Right click to move your camera and your character. You can see she's moving around with me there. And moving around to stay in, to move around freely by using the W key and then my camera. Also using the left mouse key, I can also move the camera around independently of my character, so you can see her lovely face. Also, like EverQuest, if you hold down both mouse buttons, your character moves around on their own, with you moving around the character to point in the right direction. I believe it's a little slower than EverQuest 2. The mount movement speed is definitely slower. That might be something that just came with all of the patches that happened to the game. That might have been patched in to EverQuest 2 to have the mounts move at a faster pace for just player quality. But at least it is that speed in World of Warcraft. This game also does have the three big classes of the tank, the healer, and the DPS. Something that I didn't quite mention in EverQuest 2 was that these games make the player face whatever they're fighting for, that little bit of realism. Future games would actually move you to be facing it automatically. I just brought up some items, so I might as well talk about bags now. Just like in EverQuest 2, pressing a key on your keyboard will bring up your bag space. And also like EverQuest 2, you start off with a backpack and then you can add more bags as you quest along. Or increase a bag size for a price. Down here you see I can hold 4 extra bags and my main bag. And finally, we will talk to an NPC, and we have one right over there. Just like with the Quill in EverQuest 2, they have this exclamation point above their head, and you can see where you're going towards on the mini-map here. When you click on your guy, he'll bring up this little bar here that tells you the story of what the quest is. It takes away the speech bubbles from EverQuest 2 and puts everything just in the accept or deselect box. And that's going to be all for this section of UI and playfield commentary.
It's no surprise that this is a fun game to play. But why is this so addicting, though? I think we can get an idea of why by looking at one aspect of the game, the quests. At first glance, the quest seems to be pretty simple and perhaps monotonous. They usually fall into a few categories: killing and or gathering X number of things, protecting an NPC, attunement quest, basically visit multiple places to unlock something, usually a raid or a dungeon, and delivery quest. This last subcategory actually helps with the immersion and adds to the agency of players, as discussed in the Game Studies article written by Faltin Karlsen. These quests often take the character to a new zone or a new area, and therefore serve as vehicles for further exploration of the game. Now, by themselves, these quests may sound underwhelming, but like Karlsen also writes, the benefit of this limitation, however, is that the quests are easily recognizable by the player, and normally quite easy to complete. The semiotic system surrounding the quest system points in the same direction. Simplicity is key. To make an analogy, if the player is a train and quests are the tracks, then what is the fuel to make the train move forward? That is the effect of getting experience on the player. As the player plays, they get experience to level up and gain skills, and the ability to get better gear and weapons.
This makes the player not want to stop playing, especially when the quest is so easy and comfortable. This is described in a Yukaichou.com article on WoW addiction. The majority of players who experienced WoW addiction to the game report the overwhelming need for their characters to level up, gain new skills, and become more powerful. Speaking from experience, it is very hard to stop the quest train once on it. The game is packed to the point where something is always happening, whether that's getting new gear, leveling up, or moving into a new area. The game is always going to give the player a new something to keep them engaged. Just when things start to feel like they are slowing down, the player reaches the point where they have to start interacting with other players through dungeons, which is actually a tactic in endearing the game to the player by making them feel invested in the game and other players. Again, this is from the Yukaichou.com article. Much of World of Warcraft's gameplay is designed so that players can only complete certain quests as a member of a group. Because players must rely on one another, every individual must understand that his role in the game also supports the greater good of the group. That is what I believe is what WoW added to the genre, a focus on community and simplicity. Games like EVE Online are famous for the massive amount of player interaction, but those games were usually hard to get into because of a steep learning curve or a large amount of time needed to actually get to that interaction level. WoW eases the player into the MMORPG mindset. From the way they had set up the questing that we talked about earlier, players were introduced to the full game piece by piece, never being overwhelmed. In one of the first areas for my character, I was tasked with fighting weak monsters and saving survivors of a shipwreck. I was asked to help clean up after a catastrophic event, not stop the incident. I wasn't strong enough to stop it, and I want to get stronger. By the time players get to the end of the game, they are actively participating in stopping world-ending events. They do this standing next to other players that have similar experiences to them. Real quick, I would like to talk about something that is different about this game compared to the ones I've already played. And that is that you still have to pay for WoW technically. I've been playing for free because WoW has a free trial up to level 20. But after that, you need to pay a $15 a month sub. And if you want to play the newest expansion Shadowlands, you have to pay for Shadowlands and also play the monthly sub. Of all of the current ways to pay for MMOs, this one is the most straightforward besides just having a renewable subscription like Final Fantasy XIV. It's not extremely important for this game, but seeing as all of the games I've been playing so far are free, I thought I should include it. Now let's wrap up. There wouldn't be another MMORPG that would be as popular as WoW for years. Final Fantasy XIV is the closest game, in my opinion, to take the throne of MMO King. That doesn't mean that other companies didn't try. The next video will be taking a look at what MMORPGs look like after WoW's debut. Small spoiler, they would copy WoW's formula for the most part, while focusing on one part to add their own flavor to. Now, last thing I'd like to do is I thought I would rank the MMOs that I've played up to this point, including the other games I have played over the last few months. And here we go. At number 5 and pulling up the rear, we have the original EverQuest. It was extremely confusing and kind of unintuitive to play, and I really don't see it coming up from the bottom. At number 4, we have Meridian 59. It's a lot of fun to play, but without a lot of content. That's not a knock against it, but I couldn't put it above the other MMOs on the list. EverQuest 2, in my opinion, if you want to play EverQuest, just play EverQuest 2. It's the same world, and it's a lot more fun to play and easier to get into. At number 2, we have World of Warcraft. I've spoken at length about this game at this point. It's a lot of fun, but I just couldn't put it above my absolute favorite game, Final Fantasy XIV. I also have a video on that, which I can link in the description. In my opinion, it just tells a more concise story. The world's more fun to get into, and the bosses are a lot more fun. But, again, this is all just my opinion. And in part 3, we'll be adding 2 more games to this list. And with that, I'd like to thank y'all for watching. Again, we have part 3 coming up in the next couple of videos. Please like and subscribe and come back for more and as we look through the MMORPG genre. Thank you again. Goodbye.